Welcome to the pre-lecture for Week 3 of Industrial Ecology, Fall 2018. I'm Joshua Skov. I will have a quick pop quiz in class. There's your hint. Not telling you any more right now. Let me skip ahead here. So, quick overview of the week. This is going to be just about all about urban mobility. It will spin off into a variety of other themes along the way. I will take a few moments to foreshadow the Internet of Things that we'll cover in a little greater detail a couple of weeks out. But here are the building blocks that we'll use to take this industrial ecology metaphor seriously in the setting of urban mobility. Whole series of building blocks, and I will go through all of these right now. I am expecting you to read all of these, read or watch, but they're just about all pretty short, so I think it'll be fairly easy material to get through. So, the industrial ecology of urban mobility, a few themes right here. Remember, by industrial ecology of something, we mean the constellation of technologies and business models that interact. It can also mean the flow of energy, materials, information, and other resources through an economic system, and just systems themselves. So urban mobility is going to turn out to be a really good case study. It's going to allow us to consider the major resource efficiency opportunities and issues. We will talk about new business models, maybe first and foremost. And as you'll see, if you haven't already gathered this from reading the newspaper, this will beg a lot of policy questions about what should be and what could work best. And then I think this will touch on issues of design and intentionality with cities and transportation. What is the purpose of these places? What sort of policies do we want? What kind of urban design would be desirable? More on that in class. Now, a few other quick themes here. Some clarifications that I can spend more time with people on in office hours. But very quickly, electricity is a low-carbon transportation fuel. It can be slightly low-carbon, a little bit better than gasoline and diesel. It can be a lot better. Ask me for more details. But the reason you see EVs as a low-carbon action item is that, in general, they are. Biking and walking are very low-carbon transportation modes. So if you combine EVs and biking and walking, you'll see that you have a bunch of action items from the standpoint of reducing resource use and addressing climate change. Also, a single car performing multiple tasks simultaneously will go fewer miles and cause less traffic than individual cars for all of those tasks. And that's true for any kind of car or vehicle, but we'll want to think about that as we look closely at some of the business models. And then a single car deployed through car sharing can substitute for many personally owned vehicles. So I want you to think about insights like this as we dig in more deeply. There are going to be some spillovers from transportation to land use and housing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this in class, but many of you might be interested in real estate development and the housing market. You may know that we have some big outstanding issues, really a housing crisis in much of the United States right now. So it's important to see that transportation and land use challenges are probably best solved in tandem. I'll spend a little bit of time on this webinar that you had, but in particular I want you to think about Zipcar, Lyft, and Uber in the context of the article or of the webinar that you're watching. And I'll also want to just briefly chat about some of the more seemingly more drastic or extreme moves that you'll see by some cities out there. Oslo, the largest city and capital of Norway, moved last year to ban cars from the city center within just a few years. That may sound pretty crazy to some people, but the point is to understand exactly why one would do that and then what sort of urban mobility ecosystem could substitute for that. So let's dive into some of the material briefly. Lyft and Uber, and the case of Ride Austin, and the case of Jump Bikes, which Uber has acquired. And I want you to see all of these as about ride-hailing, but also the extensions of ride-hailing into some other areas. So what did I just say? I said ride-hailing. Let's talk about the terminology. I think ride-hailing appropriately draws the parallel with the taxi. Ride sourcing is a term I've noticed in a few places. Doesn't pop up a ton though, but it actually could be accurate from the consumer standpoint. Ride sharing and ride share get used a lot, but let's be honest, they're pretty inaccurate because most of those rides are not genuinely shared. And since sharing is an option with that platform, but doesn't necessarily happen, we probably want to distinguish between shared rides and regular ride-hailing rides. And then the more sterile, legalistic term that I'm starting to see more where people are trying to be neutral and sound official is transportation network company. So TNC is by no means a universal term, but it's out there. I will want you to ask again whether it's truly accurate. Is Uber a network, or is it just a platform? I think that's worth considering. I will think of it at the very least as a platform. So I want you to think hard about ride-hailing apps as a platform for a few things. First of all, they're a platform for car drivers, say car owners really, to sell the incremental utilization of an asset, their cars. It's also a platform for riders to find drivers, and sometimes to find each other, as in the case of Lyft Line and Uber Pool. And there are some other examples we might look at in class. And then it's also a platform for ride-hailing companies to sell people other things. Right now, it looks like they're angling toward transportation options, but it could be other stuff. But certainly the case of Jump will be exactly this. It'll be offering other options. And you see that graph down below. That's the one from the article about Jump bikes. I want you to take a close look at that graph and make sure you understand it. We will chat about it more in class. The next building block we have is Zipcar and Peace Health rides. And these two new products, really services, are worth looking at closely. First, I want you to ask what these services are exactly. Like, what is it exactly that they're offering? If you've never run into car sharing and bike sharing, I want you to take a close look. I want you to see the different ways in which they are priced, essentially the different pricing plans, and ask yourself whether they are a good deal. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, in your view. So some deeper questions I'll push you on. First, what sort of consumption does a particular pricing plan incentivize? In other words, once you sign up for pricing of a particular kind, what does that nudge you toward or nudge you away from? And specifically, what does that express about the business model? What do you learn about what the business is trying to achieve as a result of that pricing scheme? Also, do the marketing claims apply to your household? Especially for Zipcar, they make a bunch of claims about the kind of money that you would save by going with car sharing over car ownership. And for you personally, what pricing plan would make sense? Maybe right now, or maybe in a recent living situation elsewhere. Explain why that plan makes sense. Maybe jot some notes down, and we'll talk about it in class. And finally, which modes, in other words, beyond bike share itself, appear to be the best complements to bike share? Personally owned vehicle, owning your own bike, taking transit, ride-hailing, car sharing. Which modes seem to work best with bike share? I want you to think about that as well. We will talk about the mode of the day, really, scooters, and specifically we'll take a look at this article by the founder of a now defunct ride-hailing company, Sidecar. Sunil Paul wrote this piece recently. The Scooter Wars will be a bloodbath and Uber will win. It's really summed up by this punchy comment. The Uber of scooters is going to be Uber. Despite not having a single scooter, it is already a dominant incumbent with significant built-in advantages. Pretty strong words. So why are we looking at this at all? Some of you might be wondering. The context of this piece is that electric scooters are killing it right now. People have figured out how to combine scooters and batteries, and I guess little motors, and apps, right? A platform, just like ride-hailing, or bike share, really. And the scooters have arrived en masse in a bunch of municipal, or I should say metropolitan markets around the country. There's also a hint, or many hints now, that scooters are part of a bigger transportation play. Both Bird and Lime have raised venture capital money with valuations of around $1 billion. And yes, that's billion with a B. And there's also been a lot of angst and worry around scooters as they've shown up in places. Some kind of really desperate policy action in San Francisco to address what people have referred to as scooter litter. That image in the backdrop here in the background is is an example of scooter litter for sure, a big pile of them in San Francisco. So some places have already started banning them or restricting them. And we'll want to look closely at these and try to understand like what the what the purpose of these what the purpose of scooters could be. The questions I'll have you ask are these: what are Sunil Paul's basic arguments for why Uber will dominate the scooter market eventually? That's really interesting because remember, they're not even in that market yet. What exactly are the arguments for why these modes should show up on the same platform? Do you buy those arguments? He makes a few specific comments, so take a look at those. And finally, he says that Uber will dominate this market, but will there be room for others? I think that's an important question. Will there still be some competition out there? The next piece we'll look at is a great report last year from UC Davis, Disruptive Transportation, the Adoption, Utilization, and Impacts of Ride-Hailing in the United States. And this is, well, you'll be able to piece through these elements of the study. I call out a few here. I won't read them to you. But this is the first really serious piece of research like it on ride-hailing. And we're really going to need to look closely at it to understand how it relates to other modes, what the opportunities are for it, and what the impacts are on traffic, how consumers treat this. This is the kind of thinking I want you to do. So I'll stress just a couple of things here. First, I really want you to focus on the questions, not just the answers. Let's take a look at some of the answers, but this is pretty new stuff, right? We haven't had ride-hailing around long enough and haven't had the opportunity to connect it to other modes for long enough to know how this could all shake out. But I do like this analysis, and I like the kind of questions it asks. It also mentions these variations of ride-hailing involving genuine sharing. I think that's important to have that in there. And it stresses the connections to other modes. The one example we'll take a closer look at is Figure 8. The relationship between vehicle ownership and transit and ride-hailing, transit use and ride-hailing. And plan on digging into that and asking yourself some deeper questions about it, because that is maybe the biggest relationship that we'll want to speculate about, the one between ride-hailing and transit. And speaking of transit, we're going to think critically about that for a little bit. I say thinking anew about an old service because you probably heard of public transit before and there's nothing sexy and new about it. But to put all these other modes in context, we will want to zero in on it a little bit. So why bother thinking hard about it? First of all, it has some inherent benefits, as you'll see laid out in these readings. But its role should probably change as we get other modes. And we might have some distracting personal experiences as starting points. I know plenty of folks who come from places, myself included actually, where the bus was really just something for poor people or desperate people who had no other transportation mode. And that's an impoverished understanding of transit in today's world, especially when transit might become more useful in the presence of these other modes. So the two places where I'll have you look closely at this, both come from Jarrett Walker in one form or another. He's an urbanist, consultant and writer, lives in Portland, and he's written a neat article on the geometry of transit that you'll see. Definitely dig into that. And it's a little funny, but I think it'll get the point across well. And JWA is Jarrett Walker's consulting firm. It's done some work for our local transit agency here in Eugene, Lane Transit District. And you'll look at just a single page of the Choices Report, some context for some planning that was done earlier this year. And I like that one page because it has it makes a case for why to take transit seriously and why to invest in it. Really quickly, a couple of questions I want you to have thought of when you get to class. First, are we, as human beings, sufficiently similar to Bort's to support Walker's conclusions? You will need to read the geometry of transit to know what I'm asking there. And second, I want you to consider the discussion of the benefits of transit and ask, have you experienced transit that fulfills this vision, or have you experienced transit that falls short? Good to have a chance to talk about that. So take a look at both of those short pieces. And also take a look at these two graphs and make sure that you take a little bit of time to understand them. So that's the pre-lecture. I know this is pretty quick and it's an overview without going through all the material, but I wanted to give you some integrating comments to start with. I look forward to seeing you in class.